Wanderer, aka Scaramouche, aka our esteemed hat guy, is getting his second rerun in Genshin Impact. And since the last time I did a video, Wanderer has not only gotten a couple new teams, but I've also gotten a lot better at playing with him. And I think a lot of people might be underrating just how strong he can be, but he does come at a cost. Like many other characters, Wanderer is a hypercarry, and hypercarries sit at a really interesting place in the Genshin Impact meta. And so in this video, we're going to discuss what's new with Wanderer and the problem with hypercarries. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. Wanderer is very straightforward to understand and build. If you want even more in-depth analysis, I did do a Wanderer guide previously, but I'm going to rapid fire give you everything you need to know. You need to level 90 him. If you're really going to main him, you should probably crown his normal attack. That's a higher priority than 9ing his skill. And I wouldn't neglect your burst either. In AoE, his burst does a substantial amount of nuke damage, and it's very, very useful for bursting down bosses. Wanderer is a character that you can triple crown because he is a hyper carry. I'm not saying you need to triple crown him to get good results out of him. I obviously haven't, and I've gotten good results. But if you really want to main him, you do want to invest. For weapons, he has 3 top tier picks and some other solid choices as well. The Tulatupa Bell, his signature, is obviously his general best in slot, but in certain circumstances, cash flow also can be his best in slot, although he is at risk over capping on crit, especially in Farina teams. And in a lot of circumstances, the Widsith can also be his best in slot. And when I say that cash flow can be his best in slot, it's almost always not, but look at the little hat. He's got a little hat. It's so cute. And also the cash flow has actually been on good weapon banners, where his signature weapon has only been on awful weapon banners. And I think the difference is about 1 to 2% between cash flow and his signature. And if you have R5 the Widsith, as long as you're willing to reset for either the attack or the elemental damage bonus, and you're using Bennett on the team, it can potentially be better than the other 5-star weapons. So that's really, really cool. The Skyward Atlas, if you got that from the standard banner, is also a really, really good weapon. He loves the attack. And if you don't have any of those, the craftable Fontaine weapon is also really, really good. You can use other 5-star stat sticks as well to fix your crit ratio, and it'll be a bit better than the craftable catalyst, but ideally you're going to aim for his signature, cash flow, or the Widsith, or the Skyward Atlas is not that far behind. And Lost Prayer is okay too. He just wants stats, and as a hyper carry, the more you invest into him with better weapons, the better he's going to perform for you. But I think the fact that it at least does have a craftable weapon that's at least solid is a pro. For artifacts, obviously his signature is his best. You want to make sure you do a charge attack to activate the set. His general best combo is normal attack, charge attack. Although sometimes charge attack spam can be better if you're fighting AoE, and it can group enemies and it can stagger enemies. So there's lots of situations where charge attack spam can be your best. You kind of just have to play the combo that works best with the enemies. Yeah, his signature set is very good. If you're using Farina, then Marchese Hunter is a great option. And you can, of course, use 2-piece Animo, 2-piece attack, etc. You can also use Shimenawa. Shimenawa is quite good on him. But like I said, in a lot of situations, his burst is very powerful. So I highly do recommend farming his signature set. And you might say, well, that's not very resin efficient. And you're right. But first of all, Flowers of Paradise is not a bad set to get. It is best in slot for Hyperbloom. So it's actually not an inefficient set to farm if you're farming it for Wanderer. You can easily get your Kuki or your Nilu team or your Burgeon team a good set. But more than that, you don't get Wanderer to be efficient. And we'll talk about this in the problem with hypercarries section of the video. But he's not an efficient character. He's a strong character, but he's a greedy boy. He's a greedy boy. He's a greedy stat goblin, and he must be fed high investment, and he has expensive taste. He's a brat with expensive taste, and you need to feed him. So get in that domain and start farming. And if you don't want to do that, then you don't deserve him, to be honest. Because the next thing you want to invest is in his handler. Without his handler, Wanderer gets into all sorts of trouble. And he really needs Faruzan to keep him in line, and Faruzan needs C6 to properly keep him in line. The Wondrous Path of Truth, probably the best constellation in the entire game, gives 40% increased crit damage to Animo damage, or when they deal Animo damage. It applies her skill, which applies the debuff, and applies crowd control, and activates more energy. And because her C6 makes her skill proc, you can run Tenacity, which is a very OP artifact set, to be honest, that really boosts Wanderer's damage a lot. And on top of all of this, Faruzan just becomes a ridiculous character. She's very easy to build once you get C6. You just do Fav, which you get for free, ER Sands, and then literally whatever. You can build her for damage, but it literally doesn't matter. Her talents don't matter all that much either. you can level her burst, but like, yeah, you ideally want to level her for damage eventually, but that's so not important. The important thing is getting her C6, making sure she has enough ER, and you're good to go. It's not that she's completely useless without C6, but that is where you will unlock Wanderer's actual power, which puts him in line with other DPS in the games. We'll finish with vertical investment. If you get vertical investment on your Wanderer, if you get a constellation or two, his C2 is really big. His C1 is nice. His C2 is really big. Then you definitely want to make sure you're using his burst all the time. And he becomes truly an absurd character with later constellations as well. You're definitely getting a properly good C6 if you go for C6. C4, C5, not as big of a deal, but C1, C2 are fine stopping points. And if you get them, if you happen to get, basically, I don't recommend going for his constellations because he absolutely doesn't need them to perform at a really high level. But if you happen to get them while wishing for Farazan C6, which you do need to get, then you're getting pretty nice constellation prizes. They're like they're constellation prizes, like constellation, but constellation prizes. That's funny. For value and power level, like I said, you don't get Wanderer because he's a valuable character. Once you get him and Farazan, like that's a great duo. You know, name a more iconic duo. And I'll show you in the team section that you can pair a lot of other characters with Wanderer Farazan when they're well invested. But that's a really expensive place to put your primos, and there's no guarantee of when you get your Farazan C6. And you can now also wish for Farazan on the Shan Yun banner, and people really underrate Shan Yun as a DPS. Shan Yun as a DPS is relatively close to Zhao and Wanderer if you consider the fact that she's easy to play. If you don't believe me, check out my Shan Yun guide. She gets amazing clears as a DPS, especially if you were to get a C1 or C2 of your Shan Yun on their way to get Farazan, as her C2 is absolutely insane, in addition to also being a really good exploration character. Now, I'm not saying that Wanderer is like a worse DPS than Shan Yun. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that Shan Yun, in addition to being an Animo DPS herself, also enables other characters to be great DPSs, and you're getting Farazan along with her. So it kind of reduces the value of an Animo DPS. We now have 3 Animo DPSs that you can choose to go with your Farazan. I know we have characters like Hazo. Hazo can be a pretty decent Animo DPS, and Lynette at C6 can also be a decent Animo DPS. And then you also have Zhao, of course, and Wanderer, and all these characters want Farazan. And so it's not like he's bringing some insane account value. I would put him about on the same level in terms of power as Zhao and, you know, Hu Tao and Linny. These are all really good DPS. I'd put Navia around there. Maybe some would put her a bit lower. Personally, there's good DPS in like there's the top. I recently did a top 5 DPS video you can check out, but there's like the top 3 that are really clear, and then there's sort of a bunch of others. And, you know, I would put Wanderer, Zhao, Navia, Raiden, Linny, Hu Tao. I'd put all of those in the next level. You know, a lot of people don't agree with Raiden, but it's tough because Raiden's also a driver and she brings other things than just raw DPS. So it's tough. And then I'd put Shan Yun as a DPS herself, just a smidge below. But the fact that she enables so many other teams and other elements and other playstyles and other options make her a more valuable pull. So Too Long Didn't Read, you won't be disappointed with Wanderer if you go for him for power, if you're willing to really invest in him, but he's not like this valuable pull. In addition, not everyone's gonna like his playstyle. He's got some noticeable gameplay flaws, namely that if you don't use a shield, it feels really bad to get hit as Wanderer. It takes him longer than normal to recover from being hit, and that can make him a pain in the butt to play without a shield. If you're willing to learn enemies' attack patterns, however, then this can be mitigated. And his damage with a shield, I used to say his damage with a shield wasn't good. I've seen the light. For the overworld, obviously, Abyss performance is something that I highly consider when I'm looking at a new character because I like to know how strong they are, but you spend most of your game in the overworld, so I think it's very actually relevant to talk about how good a character is in the overworld, and Wanderer is definitely one of the best. Not only is he fast, not only does he have an infusion on his normals that's attached to his skill and not to his burst, not only does he still do damage outside of that damage, I'm going to call it a damage infusion. Not only does he have synergy with Yelan, one of the best overworld characters, but he also has really good vertical mobility, and he also has good horizontal mobility, and he's very, very fast. So overall, he's just amazing for the overworld, one of the best. And I would not, fault you for never having him leave your overworld team. I personally don't actually use him in the overworld, and there's two reasons. One is because he has a stupid face and a stupid bowl cut and stupid short. If those things were, and he's also really annoying when he goes, nah, that's really annoying. So those are the main reasons I don't use him in the overworld, to be honest. But the other is that his flight is really, really good, but it doesn't last as long as I really want it to. Like Yelan's lasts feels like twice as long. And I am biased because I do have her C1, and I also have Shen Yun, and I have Shen Yun C1. So because of this, I just try and use Shen Yun and Yelan on my overworld team, and those pretty much give me what I need in terms of both vertical and horizontal. But I think Wanderer is potentially more efficient and better. I wish he had a C1. I wish his C1 gave him more dashing stamina, so you could dash for longer. Maybe you couldn't attack as long, attacking took the same, but you could dash more. That would have been really, really great. Yeah, that's what I really wish that Wanderer had, and that would actually, change the game for me. But regardless of that, I still think he's one of the best overworld characters. If he's not the very best, he's definitely top 3. So I wouldn't necessarily wish for him for the overworld, but I think getting one of or two of Wanderer, Yelan, Shen Yun, I think that's a good idea, because it'll just make your experience nicer if you feel the need to have a better overworld experience. So that's what I think. Let's go into his teams now. The Bennett Toma core is really, really good, especially for AoE. That Wanderer can hit all of the enemies they're already grouped up, or you can group them up with AI manipulation. Toma Bennett core is really, really good. Toma is great for Wanderer. You can put Bennett on a healing set like Song of Days Past or Clam or something like that, and then give Toma Noblesse. And if you have Toma's C6, then he gives normal and charge attack boost. I think actually just normal attack boost, but still Wanderer uses the normal attack boost, and that's very nice. I don't know if I would recommend Toma before C4. You can still make it work with enough energy, but it's going to be tough before C4. Before C2 it's going to be very, very tough, but you don't have to use Toma. Layla is the other option that I can definitely recommend, especially if you happen to have a high constellation Layla, which you might from this banner. It's much easier to get Wanderer's passive. Wanderer's passive, when he swirls an element, when he uses his skill, he gets a bonus effect. So Swirling Cryo gives him crit rate, and that's really, really good. It's unreliable for me as a pre-C6 Layla gamer. I do get it sometimes, of course, but sometimes you don't get it. So, but Toma's is very much more reliable. But even still, especially C4 Layla, she gives a buff. So Layla, really, really good, and a very strong shield as well. Really big fan of Layla with Wanderer. I'm also a pretty big fan of the double Geo comp. Depending on the content, this could be slower or faster than the Toma version. The downside of this comp is you're getting less buffs onto your Wanderer, and you're spreading out the damage a bit more by having Chiori do a large portion of your damage. So if your Chiori isn't invested super, super well, and your Wanderer is, this team will perform worse for you. The better your Wanderer is, basically, the better it is just to hyper buff Wanderer with a team like this. But I still really like it, and it clears really, really nicely. If you want to go absolutely giga buff, Forzan Bennett Farina gives him absolutely absurd damage. It makes him very squishy, and it's not always the best. Depending on the Abyss. This team isn't as good as it was in the last Abyss, or the Abyss before the last Abyss. Last Abyss was rough for this team. This is just basically not my go-to recommendation, but it's a team that if it works out, this is what you want to do. You may want to make sure you build Bennett on a super big healing set, HP, and you can go 2-piece Maiden's Beloved, 2-piece Clam, because Bennett, you want him to heal as much as possible, and sometimes you'll lose Bennett uptime because you have to heal up either Farina or Farazan a bit so that you can make the most of Farina's buff. But even with all those caveats, and even with it being squishy, it is super, super powerful. You can also, for another version, pre-Farina, you can swap Farina for Yelan, and Yelan is super good here because not only does she do great damage in single target, this would be a single target focused team where you're going to normal attack spam mostly, but she also buffs Wanderer with her A4, so this is a really, really good team. And if the enemies are freezable, you can do Xingqiu or Yelan in this slot and use Layla or Charlotte or Diona, I guess, but I don't like Diona here as much as Layla or Charlotte. And if you build your Charlotte right, you can do Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayer. It is difficult to get enough ER, but you can do it if you believe hard enough. And this team is really, really good in freezable content because you've got a little bit of grouping from Farzan. Wander has pretty good AoE. You'll have to alternate between normal and charge attacks depending, and you can keep the enemies frozen. Depending on the enemies, sometimes Xingqiu can just be better because Yelan is more single target locked than Xingqiu is. So yeah, but this is really good when you can freeze. For proper AoE, I really, really like Kazuha Bennett, where you're grouping enemies and grouping them with Kazuha and then charge attacking with Wanderer. This is really, really good for groupable. One of the cool things you can do with this is Kazuha can be built on a DPS build, so you're going to build them with whatever DPS artifacts you have. Still, you can, yeah, you don't have to use Viridess Inventor. You can use, you know, your leftover pieces from the Wanderer set that you didn't get to farm and put them on Kazuha. 2-piece Anemo, 2-piece attack, give him a crit sword. He's going to be getting good energy from Farzan, so he'll be able to burst fairly often. And he's just going to be like doing good sub DPS Anemo damage. You don't have to use Kazuha here. You can also use Venti, who will group obviously in a different way. Sometimes he'll be better, sometimes the other will be better. You can also use Lynette if you build your Lynette for damage. If you just want to use Lynette, this is pretty cool. I like using Lynette, to be honest, because it does taunt enemies and can make it easier to go shielderless with Wanderer. So if you want to use Lynette, this is a pretty nice option. And if you, especially when you get higher constellations or you just invest heavily into Lynette, this is a pretty good option. I do like it. And there's other options too. You can use Yunjin, you can use Fischl. You'll notice every single one of my team recommendations had C6 Farzan in it. So that's just because it's always the best, but you can take Farzan out of any of these teams and put in someone else, right? You can do, right, double Hydro with Xingqiu, right? You can put in, you know, Farina onto this team. Like, you can mix and match. Just don't be, just because I put Farzan onto every single one of these teams doesn't mean you have to do that. Wanderer is a hyper carry that wants to be buffed. So if you're willing to buff him, like, you can use C4 Gene if you happen to have that. Yunjin is pretty good in single target at buffing Wanderer. Really falls off in AoE, but pretty good in single target. One of the other really good teams for AoE that I forgot to mention uses Xiangling. I got a really nice clear with this in the Magu Kenki floor. You can do like a Wanderer National if you want, something like this. It really is up to you, and that gives him a nice flexibility to use in different kinds of combat content, as opposed to some other hyper carries who are a bit more locked into what they want. But most of Wanderer's best teams will use Farzan and will usually use Bennett. But again, it's not like you have to. You can replace Bennett here with a Yelan. This was the freeze team, right? Or you can use Toma here. It's just don't forget Bennett gives a lot of stats, so you don't have to use him. But Wanderer is a hyper carry. He's a stat goblin. He gobbles up all your stats and he gives you pretty good results in return. So that's what's new with Wanderer. Now I want to talk to you about the problem with hyper carries. So who are the hyper carries? What is a hyper carry? We got Wanderer, we got Zhao, we got Eula. I think I'm gonna put Arlecchino up here as well. We got Ito. I think you should call Ito a hyper carry. I think you call Novelette a hyper carry. Melt Ganyu is kind of a hyper carry. I mean, yeah, Melt Ganyu is a hyper carry. Freeze Ganyu, hard to call her a hyper carry, but Ayaka pretty much is. There's probably some more, but this gets the idea across. The main idea with hyper carry characters is that they're characters that do the majority of your team's damage, number one. And number two, you pretty much have to build your team around buffing them. So I think those are like the two things about being a hyper carry. And what is the problem with this? Well, Novelette doesn't count because he's cheating, but I'll talk about why. But for most of them, these are characters that have pretty mediocre performance at low investment. So mediocre, in fact, that if you were to give them like super relatable investment, they just would not be very good. And there's a spectrum. On the spectrum down are characters like Child, not a hyper carry. Like, and I'm talking about Child and Xiangling as a team, right? Not a hyper carry, and characters like Yoimiya, characters like Raiden, characters like Hu Tao and Alhaitham. These are characters that are not hyper carries, but they do contribute a solid amount of damage to their team, and they get a bunch of their damage from reactions or from off-field DPSs that will make up for some damage. So if you have a spread out damage profile, it's easier to get an overall decent results with your team. And then we have full reaction DPS like Nilu Bloom or Hyper Bloom or Burgeon, where as long as you hit these pretty easy to meet baselines, because you don't need a full set of EM. You can do two-piece EM. That's really, really easy to do. 4-piece Gilded it's going to be easy to get an EM set of Gilded, but even if you're super unlucky, 2-piece Gilded, 2-piece Wanderer's Troop, it's really easy to reach a certain threshold with these characters. And so at low investment for a new player, these characters are absurdly easy to build, and they will do so much damage. And then these characters will feel stronger with less damage, like less investment. And then these characters will feel very weak, some of them will, until you get good investment. But at good investment, they can bridge the gap. So if we're talking low investment, I'm going to leave off Arlecchino and Novelette for now. But if we're talking low investment, like your Bloom characters are going to feel so insanely good. Your other characters are going to feel pretty darn good, because their individual character strength is a factor as well, and your investment in the characters. But other characters will feel really good, and then at your high investment characters will feel kind of trash. They're not really ordered, by the way, don't get triggered. And then as your level of investment rises, these characters start to feel better and better and better, and they climb up the tier list with investment. Then you start getting a couple constellations, and you get some 5-star weapons. And now, Nilu has a 5-star weapon that makes her feel insane. But if you start getting, a bunch of constellations on these characters, or you get C2 Shen Yun for Zhao, and you get C2 Wanderer and C2 Farina, and all of a sudden, like, these characters are feeling worse, right? Because you're getting, you get C2 Raiden and she feels good, and then you start getting C6, and then she starts feeling worse. And so there's the resin investment, there's the constellation investment. And so where does that leave us? That means that when I make a tier list, right now I'm working really hard on my pre-Natlin definitive tier list. It's really hard to rank hypercarries. So it's a problem for me. It's a problem for new players, because you don't see the fruits of your labor until you have like 200 plus crit ratio and some other useful substats as well. Otherwise, like you're starting to get level 9 and 10 talents versus other characters that just feel good right out of the gate. Now, characters like Novelette and to a degree Arlecchino, they absolutely cheat. Novelette cheats because HP scaling is inherently higher, because there's less HP buffers to balance around. You don't have tenacity for tenacity of the Millith for HP. You don't have Noblesse Oblige for HP. You don't have Bennett for HP. You don't have Chevreuse for HP. You just have Hydro Resonance, essentially. And Novelette cheats, so Novelette cheats in that way. He also cheats by having access to Marchese Hunter, which gives a ridiculous amount of crit rate, making it very easy to build this character and achieve hypercarry level stats with lower investment. And as a result, even though at high investment, the difference between Novelette and other characters, like, yes, he is the best DPS, but the difference between him and Alhaitham, Hu Tao, Arlecchino, I think Arlecchino is already there, but even Zhao and Wanderer and even other characters, Raiden, yes, he's the best DPS, but the difference is not nearly as great when you reach high investment. So Novelette is just absolutely cheating. Arlecchino is kind of cheating in the sense that she just has a lot of damage already. Like, she's just overtuned. So even though it's not as, and a lot of people have a good gladiator set, so that it's kind of cheating in that way as well. But for the most part, hypercarries are a problem for new players because they take a lot of investment to really pop off. And then they're a problem for content creators, because how do we rate these characters? Do we rate at low investment? Do we rate at high investment? Do we rate at mid-level investment? Most people rate at a mid-level investment, but it's not always so simple. It's not always so obvious. Do you rate him with Faruzan C6? Do you rate him without Faruzan C6? And I know a lot of people say, that's why tier lists are horrible. And I disagree. I just think that you either need to have more context attached to the tier list picture, which I will this time. I'm excited for it. Or you just need to people need to actually watch the whole video so they can get the full explanation and get the nuance. Because it's not, for me, tier lists, yes, I do have a certain standard, and we'll talk about that in a future video, and I do have, a final rating that I stand behind, but at the same time, you need to know the context and the nuance behind that description, and it's very, very important. But let me know if you have an experience of any characters that weren't good when you first got them and that felt good after a while, after putting investment into them, or maybe you had to learn their combos, right? Ito, not only does he need a lot of stats, but you have to learn his combos. When I first just mashed with him, didn't perform very well. When I learned his combos, he performed quite a bit better, and he was pretty decent after I learned properly. And I think the biggest one for me This is the biggest personal example, is Hyper Bloom was insane. It still is insane, by the way. Still is absolutely cracked, and Double Hydro Hyper Bloom is ridiculous. But Yelan and Xingqiu require some pretty good investment too, so I understand, you know, people are going to say that Hyper Bloom isn't as low investment as you're making it sounds. Kind of true, but you can really reduce your Hyper Bloom gear and it still clears really, really fast, which is not the same for Hypercarry characters. But anyways, what I've noticed is a lot of my, as I invest more and more into Hu Tao and into my Raiden teams, into my Hytham teams, into my Arlecchino teams, into my Novelette teams, these teams feel on par, if not better, than the Hyper Bloom teams that I was playing before. And again, Wanderer and Zhao as well. They were feeling worse than Hyper Bloom as I invested, as I got these higher and higher talent levels, as I got better and better artifacts, as I learned the mechanics of the characters more and more, they started to feel better. And now I don't use Hyper Bloom all that often, whereas I used to always use it as a default before. I guess the other problem with Hypercarries is that Bennett, most Hypercarries are attack scaling and Bennett, and I really believe that the Pyro Archon's gonna be a Bennett in some way. Baizhu is also rerunning, and I did a banner review for Baizhu and Wanderer, as well as an updated Baizhu review and a healer's tier list. So make sure to check out those two videos right there. Take care. Bye for now.